Hello, my name's Courtney. I'm really happy to be here. I'm visiting the UK for a month. I just finished with the research, actually. August 31st, our site shut down after, I think it was open for about 5 years, and I was the study coordinator for 3 of them. I want to ask briefly, I'm going to cover all of it in my presentation, but out of a show of hands, who has more of an interest in the clinical psychology aspect, like the process of the participants in a clinical format? Okay, and it might be equal for everyone. How about protocol, actual research protocol, the way that the study was run? Okay, all right. And then maybe strictly the psychedelic experience or the content part of that. All right, okay, great. Well, so I was hired in March of 2020, which is a really exciting time to be hired. Am I close enough to that? Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, move this around. Okay. This one.
No, you can have, yeah, this one.
Okay. Oh, that's nice. I like that. I like to be mobile.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I applied in January 2020.
Working?
Ish.
Yeah, it takes like 10
Oh,
seconds.
it's green. Yeah, it did. It's not green. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe more of the online format.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, that's what.
Okay, great. I applied in January of 2020. Previously, I was working at public high schools teaching drama therapy and expressive arts therapy to people on the autism spectrum in special education classrooms. And I found myself being really stifled by the system there, not feeling like I could really empower students. So I found the Trauma Research Foundation. I've been interested in Bessel's work for a long time. It's what led me from pursuing a medical degree to actually looking into psychology and trauma, because I felt that every time I personally tried to access healing, I got redirected, and I noticed there's so much relation between the stress response and actual physical ailments. So that's what led me. I got a public health bachelor's, anthropology minor, and then eventually went to Lesley University to get a master's in expressive arts therapy. So anyway, January 2020, I was hired as the assistant study coordinator on the MDMA trial. And is everyone familiar with that trial, MDMA-assisted therapy? Yeah, okay. Then March 2020 happened and the pandemic started. Most of Boston shut down and our research site went on hold temporarily, though we still had to support the participants that were still active. So we were just at the tail end of MAP 1. MAP 1 was the double-blind placebo study. And we had about 3 active participants still enrolled in the trial. The FDA at that point requested that we do suicide checks, so the Columbia Suicide Scale, for 14 days after each MDMA session as an added protocol, while there was a lot of distance between the actual therapeutic support with the therapists and the participants. The protocol was updated several times throughout the study. So when I joined March, April, May, June, we finished MAP 1, and that's when the full-time study coordinator actually left, moved on to something else, and I jumped into the role full-time, which was a little intimidating. It's not a job I've had before, but I was interested in research and absolutely had an interest in psychedelics and supporting people with severe PTSD. So from August to September or October of 2020, I was monitoring all the data with the help of the clinical research associate. So the sponsor is MAPS. They're the one distributing all the source documents, the things that you need to follow, the protocol and everything. And then each site is a contractor of MAPS. So I was stuck in the office in the study site pretty much by myself for 3 months. And it reminds me of that scene in Independence Day. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, but there's a moment where the scientist comes out and he's really excited to see and make contact with people. And he's all haggard and he says, they don't let us out much. So I felt a little bit grade. However, the support of MAPS and the staff there, so it's actually the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, is a subsidiary of MAPS. So MAPS does all the fundraising, and then MAPS Public Benefit Corporation was the actual sponsor of the research that I was in contact with. Monitoring the data was really intense, so I had to look at all the different adverse events and make sure that things were cohesive, like the storyline from the therapist and the data that collected what a participant might have reported as an adverse event. And once we cleaned up the data and then submitted all the stuff for MAP 1, we started screening for MAP 2, which is the same protocol as MAP 1. It's a double-blind placebo study. The screening process is extremely rigorous, especially for the study coordinator, because I was responsible for making phone calls, looking at the recruitment website, and thousands of people applied for this study. And each person had a very significant history of trauma. And people want to talk. So the moment they actually get someone on the phone or on the other side, they want to share their story desperately. And it was always a balance between listening actively, not cutting them off, and also realizing that I wasn't in the therapy role and that they might not even make it past that phone call. So the tendency to overshare and somewhat rupture your own boundary of privacy is really common with trauma, PTSD. So that was an art form that I started to learn. My first screening phone calls, they're technically only supposed to be 20 minutes long. And I think my first one, all right, 20 minutes, what's the worst thing that's ever happened to you in your life? So my first phone call was about 45 minutes. And I found myself being, it was incredible, really, to hear people's stories and how resilient we are. So there's post-traumatic growth. And it was really a privilege to get to know each person, whether it was through just the one phone call or throughout the screening process, which had about 20 different steps before you would submit for enrollment. And MAPS would evaluate the eligibility of that participant. And then there would be another portion of screening even before they were officially enrolled, confirmed. I spoke to probably 200 people on the phone, and I had a Google Voice number that was publicized on the government website. So, and it was on my, well, I'm not sure, maybe I'll leave that detail out. I get voicemails with people telling me some of their worst traumas. And I couldn't call everybody back. I started to have to recognize my own limits. And it's a big part of my learning of how to conserve energy, and that I started to let go of the savior complex. I can't save people, and it's a definite team effort. So the Boston team was made of 7 clinicians. Most of them had about 30 years of experience, and they all have practiced ketamine-assisted therapy in their private practices. So it was really neat added benefit for me to hear their wisdom, and our team meetings were always digressions from the actual study into other clinical content and theory. And it was really great to interact with Bethel and feel what it was for someone to be under the limelight in clinical psychology and have inside experience of when someone is held at such high esteem publicly, there can be a lot of criticism that doesn't really match the person in their personal or in their actual professional practice. So anyway, I digress. So after the screening process, the phone call, sometimes it would be at the end of the phone call, I know that they would have said something that didn't qualify them for the study. And at that point, it was my responsibility to communicate that without actually disclosing what the criteria was that they didn't meet. They're welcome to go onto the government website and read the criteria that's public, but not all of the criteria was actually public. And then at that point, we bring them in for an informed consent visit. That's done with the therapist. And we were doing everything remotely at this point. So it was October 2020, October, November, December, January was the whole screening process for MAP 2. Eventually, we started to enroll participants. I think it was January was our first enrollment. February, March, April, we had about 4 people enrolled. And there's a lot of pressure coming from the sponsor because every month is money. So we were renting an apartment in Boston. It's about like $3,000 a month, plus the hours for me and the therapists that were doing the screening process. So once they go through the initial medical screening, we do a cardiovascular check and lab work to make sure there's no physiological reasons that they shouldn't take MDMA. So high blood pressure was well controlled, then that was all right. But if there was, and I'm not sure how much cardiology knowledge there is in the room, but there's a QT interval. So if it's MDMA can extend your QT interval. It's like the space between different rhythms in your heart. So occasionally people would be screened out for that. Then there is the independent raters. So independent raters are people who are totally blinded to where the participant is in the protocol. And they're all remote, located around the world actually. So the first thing would be a mini, which is an examination of psychological diagnoses. So if there was a high level of dissociative amnesia or too much dissociation as part of the trauma, then that was also a criteria where you'd be screened out, just because it's really difficult to actually hold that person in a safe environment in the research. So it's also different. Like, eventually, when this treatment is legalized, you'd have a more open pool of people that you would work with. But in this study, we know that there was certain limits in the clinical support that people would get. And then after that, we submit for their enrollment. After, there's a lot more to that, but it's a little boring. And then we have 2 preparation sessions, and that's when the participant comes in and meets with their therapist. Typically, it's a male-female pairing. I think my understanding is that it simulates that mother-daughter dynamic or a family, the opportunity for someone to work through early childhood trauma. Eventually, we did have female participants who requested a female-female therapist pairing, and that went really well on the study. So then we submit another enrollment packet, and there's something called the CAPS. So that measures the level of PTSD. And it had to be above a certain threshold for each part of the study, and that was the main metric that we used. So if the CAPS score went down, it was considered to be successful treatment. And that's V3, so we call them visit 1, visit 2, preparatory. Visit 3 is the CAPS. Visit 4 is the first prep session right before the experimental session. And then visit 5 is that first experimental session, which is 8 hours long. So participant arrives at the site, prep, make sure they have electrolyte fluids on the hand, and then we had a nice medicine bowl. So it was like, we always had we tried to simulate as much sacredness in the research setting as possible. It was also a really interesting art form and dance. So we offered the medicine bowl, the participant takes the MDMA, and the MDMA came in blister packages. And we're all extremely regulated, locked in a safe, locked behind a closet door, armed with a serious alarm system. And then at that point, the participants encouraged to lay down. So we have a really comfortable setting. Eye covering, so there's blackout eye shades, and then also noise canceling headphones. And before these sessions, the therapist and the participant would collaborate in making a playlist. Yes, time to run away. Yeah, Yeah. And so some people were more comfortable or familiar with what music they would want to hear. Sometimes they would lean into the therapist's recommendation. And now, I don't know if you look at Spotify, there's all sorts of playlists like ketamine-assisted therapy playlist, MDMA therapy, psychedelic journey. I really loved when the participants collaborated, when they had a sense of what they wanted to access. It was really funny. One of our participants wanted to listen to Tool. It's not your typical, thing. It was great. Yeah. So sometimes people want to hear music that had some nostalgia or was part of their past in some way. Thank you.
That's really
Yeah.
good.
So typically it was about maybe 45 minutes in that someone might begin to experience effects. Believe it or not, we did have some people who ended up being part of the placebo arm and feeling as though they were not part of the placebo. Yeah, that was really fascinating for me. And so they were encouraged to be inside for about 4 hours out of the entire 8 hours. That means laying down, being in your inner process, connected to your breath. And throughout the experience, taking off the shades and headphones and checking with the therapist, this is something that's coming up. I really want to explore this feeling, a somatic sensation. And the therapist would always have a plan beforehand, particularly when it comes to touch. That's really, really a curious thing, especially when you have people who are experiencing, a lot of people in the study were survivors of sexual trauma or sexual abuse. So you make a plan, what touch is okay, how are you going to share your consent? What if you decide that that touch is no longer okay? Are you okay with us squeezing your hand? So things like that. But for the most part, it was verbal processing for people. One thing that I found fascinating is, are people familiar with internal family systems, that form of therapy? Yeah. There's inner parts, right? And this is something I've heard from other people at music festivals that I've gone to. And MDMA has this way of spontaneously activating a dialogue internally. And without prompt, people would begin to talk about their parts. I have a part of me that is really resistant to this process right now. I want to run out of the room. I don't trust you. I don't trust the therapist. But there's a part of me that is devastated by that resistance. And then there's another part of me that doesn't even believe the traumatic experience that I had. And this is very complex circling sometimes. So the therapist, I was always so impressed and moved by the way that the therapists on my team would support their participants. And each one of them had a different way, a different clinical approach, different tone. So they would guide the participant, to dialogue with these parts. And it was never directive. That was one of the main things. So there's adherence criteria, all these ways in which the therapist would be reviewed. So there's always supervision. The sessions were all taped, and they would be sent to supervision at MAPS, and then the therapist would meet with their supervisors and go over what went well, what might you do differently. So one of the adherence criteria is non-directive therapy, really open-ended. You want the participant to direct their own process. So that's the first experimental session. Between each one, there would be integration. So you got 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10. So visit 10 would be the next experimental session. And it's pretty incredible to watch the process people would go through between each and what impact the integration sessions have. Really, that's the container that makes this treatment the most successful. The psychedelic experience uncontained without the support in weaving those complex aspects of the self, and then how those parts actually fit into the world, that happens in integration. So second experimental session, same thing, 8-hour long session. and I can speak to after the session. The therapists leave, and we have a night attendant show up at the site. The night attendants are always really well vetted, and we had people that were on the study with us for the full 5 years. So they usually have some therapeutic experience, but try to make it really clear that they are not operating as a therapist. So that was always really interesting for me as well. We want to keep that type of relationship between the therapist and the participant. And there's always a tendency for, not always, some participants want to be left alone after the session, so they text the night attendant, not want to communicate much, like what I want for dinner. Some people really wanted to talk, and towards the end of the study, I ended up being a night attendant for about 5 people. It was also a really fascinating way to deepen my relationship with those participants and my understanding of psychedelic-assisted therapy. It was done at night, and the next morning, the therapist would show up for the first integration session. After that, well, so during the pandemic, I just want to speak to the remoteness. It was really interesting for therapists to maintain rapport and attunement with people who were not even coming into the physical site throughout each experimental session. I was amazed actually by how much we were able to utilize the platform. We didn't use Zoom, we used something called WebEx. It's like, yeah, it's really fun glitches too. So you're supporting people who are going in and out of crisis and having audio issues. So I had many roles as a study coordinator on the study. One of them was audio and tech, audio and technician or whatever. And through those moments, I found myself really enjoying the rapport that I would build with the participants. At first, I thought when I came to the study, I need to be a blank slate. It's research. I'd be cold, don't disclose. I'm just here to make the cogs move for things to happen. But I quickly learned that that was really not the way to make it work, especially when it comes to maintaining enrollment. It's not an easy process, especially the screening process. So you have people drop out. And then also some things that the participant might not want to disclose in a therapeutic relationship, they would share, because it's not really about the therapeutic process, but like the space. What would make me feel more comfortable? What do I need out of this that I'm not getting? So then, where was I? Third session. The remote sessions. We never did an experimental session remotely. That wouldn't be safe. Although there are organizations that are doing that, like you guys are familiar with Mind Bloom, right? That's different. You're not really getting a high dose of something that is as activating as MDMA, though that's debatable. So after the third session, participants would have 5 more integration sessions, at which point we would terminate, and often the therapist would keep up a rapport with the participant just to check in occasionally, but they always talk about that with the participant, make a plan. Are you comfortable with this? Reach out if you really need anything. How are we doing on time? I'm gonna make room for questions at the end, because I want to hear, I like to gauge what you want to know, what you're curious about, because I could probably talk for the whole time. And I'm absolutely still in my process of integrating a 3-year-long experience with, some of the hardest years of my life. That's a lot to say. I myself was going through a lot, so it's one thing that I find to be really interesting is the parallel healing process that I was going through. It was so specific with some participants. The actual index trauma that they were coming in for was very related to something that I was personally processing. There's a term called therapeutic symbiosis. Some people are very anti this theory, and it's different if you're the therapist, right? But you don't have to disclose the parallel that you're experiencing. So that was another honor, I'd say. It was a real privilege to grow side by side with people. And while I was going through my own struggles, I was also held in an employment space that I never really experienced before. So all my colleagues, MAPs, everyone that was part of this project understands trauma, understands reenactment, understands what someone might need when it comes to mental health support. So I felt I was being held in a way where my privacy was really respected. I had periods of time where I actually went on medical leave. And also just a deep understanding. I didn't have to explain myself. The people on my team really understood. So let's see, after, in the middle of that too, so I've just been screening a couple hundred people. We also have like 6 participants that are active. And we started the crossover study. So the crossover study is after a group of participants were unblinded, anyone who got the placebo on the first time was offered MDMA. So for them, it was like double the therapy. So those participants came back. There was a screening process. It wasn't really as vigorous, but definitely still like a month and a half, 2 month long process. That was really neat because I got to meet participants that were already finished with the study by the time I was hired. And then I also got to have this whole other round with people that I already met. And there's a lot of trust there already established. Staff protocol, shorter, it's only 16 visits. Same as there's 3 experimental sessions overnights, 8 hours long. Typically you have the same therapy pair, so you wouldn't change the therapist. Did that happen? It did happen once or twice. We hired 2 new clinicians in the middle of that time period that were really great because they added a new energy to the team. It's interesting when a team forms, and some of the clinicians know each other for a long time before the actual study. Something I was just talking to my friend about is when I joined the study, I didn't know the culture. I came in with a lot of zeal. I would talk in the big meetings with MAPS in a way that in a couple of years, I realized that wasn't really the culture, kind of like felt the hierarchy out. I think it's really important if you are working on a study and you might hold a role that isn't considered, not sure the word I want to use. Every role is really important. So especially the study coordinator role, you're going in between everybody. So I think it's always valuable to try not to buy into power dynamics too much, but in particular here. So I felt the hierarchy of the power dynamics, whose words were considered more important. And that's not to say anything negative about MAPS or the Trauma Research Foundation. It was really just the nature of like the Western model of interacting in an organization. So, yeah, so it was great to have 2 new clinicians come on board and to get a little bit of reflection from them about things I was experiencing. Things like I came into research thinking ethics was going to be always an opportunity to improve ethics. It's crucial. There's an internal review board, so they're always reviewing the ethics. Sometimes you have to report something that happened on the study. And both organizations were definitely prioritizing ethics. But I was like just so gung-ho. I thought we could change the way that maybe the structure of the organizations doing research worked. The participants were always safe and they were always protected, and their feedback was highly considered. So yeah, when the new therapist came on board, I was validated in certain ways. I was relieving. Yeah. So then we've got 2 studies going at the same time. This is like, let's see, 2021 now. We've got MAP 2. We had 11 participants that were part of that phase of the study. And then the first crossover group was 5 participants. And you think like, oh, it's only 5 people, but it's such an intensive study. There's so much effort that's put into every participant, so much time, and only so much time really allotted. So the therapists put in a considerable more time than they were being compensated for. The suicide assessment phone calls were supposed to be 15 minutes each. So sometimes you talk to the person for an hour, right? Yeah, so once we finished math 2, that was the end of 2022. And then we finished the first crossover study, blinded people from out 2. We had the next crossover study. That one was really great because I knew each participant really well. And that's the study that we just finished. I guess we saw the last person July of this year. Yeah. Again, I just think the experience of being a study coordinator was really incredible to see both the clinical process as well as the psychedelic process. Set and setting wasn't something that I got to enjoy very much in my own experiences. So recognizing how important it is for people to feel safe, especially when what they're processing is an experience in which they were not safe. When participants were parting, there's an interesting relationship to gift giving in the therapeutic relationship. We would have mementos or gifts, and so one of the participants I worked with, I had a couple paintings in the therapy room, and I felt during the termination visit, like, do you want this painting? And because it was right across from the therapy couch, and they said, yeah, absolutely, that'd be amazing. And then later on, I said, I sent the date of when I did the painting. And he responded and he said, he sent me a picture of that exact same date and where he was on that date. And it was a really pivotal time for him, during which he's a veteran. So he was flying over, I think it was Iraq, and thinking to himself how much healing he had to do. And was really intimidated by what he felt was probably not even possible recovery. That's one of the synchronicities. Yeah, and there's a lot more of those. The same participant, and I've talked to him, he's okay with me sharing these different pieces. I'm also trained as an expressive art therapist. So I was always, I know it'll be a confounding variable this time about this, to have the participant do art, exactly. Some of them would do it after the session. So what was it about the ceilings, the therapy, the art? I don't know. So at one point I was a night attendant and I brought an expressive arts therapy book. It's a lot of words, and MDMA isn't the greatest substance for reading necessarily. It actually has a lot of effects with the ocular processing. But for some reason I felt like I was gonna leave it in the therapy room with the participant. I was like, you don't have to open it, because this thing exists. And he didn't open it, but he read the cover. And a few days later, he sent me a message. He said, I really want to make a song to play at my last session. And we talked about, found a producer locally. We ended up creating a song and invited me to be part of the first hour and a half of that last session. He did tell the therapist that he'd make the song. He put it on. It was absolutely beautiful. It was just gorgeous. And he was saying that he never thought or considered himself a creative person. But when he saw that book, and I talked to him a little bit about my experience with expressive arts therapy, he was like, well, maybe I can make a song. And it was, really integrated the index trauma that he was processing and the inflection point of his healing process. So it was special. Then we finished all of the subjects and went through all the data, cleaned that up again. The monitoring process was a little better this time around. There was speed to it, but typically the sponsor would actually come to the site to monitor the data. But once the pandemic started, they figured out we could use Google Drive. And so that was a lot of scanning. That was, the study coordinator job is so strange. You're doing everything. I was the janitor, I, at first, was doing the invoices and all the financial tracking. Luckily, we did hire a bookkeeper after a while. But I was also doing the tech and figuring out where, all the scheduling, when are the therapists available, when are the participants available, and when are the night attendants available. I don't know if you guys have tried to align your schedules, even with just one person, but I tried doing it with like 7 all at the same time. And closing down the site was really emotional for me. It's this place that I spent 3 years often by myself and going through pretty intense things, especially with the pandemic. And eventually I became bonded with the space. So I was also the mover, eventually. And I think I will tell you this story. When I was shutting down the site, we were left with like 7 giant filing cabinets, a bed, 2 couches, all kitchen stuff, table, chairs. And I had to figure out what to do with it. So I had this incredible Craigslist experience. You have Craigslist here? Yeah. I started posting all the things on Craigslist and just the amazing synchronicities that happened in the process of moving out. Someone showed up for all the filing cabinets. And I asked him what he was going to do with them, and he said he's going to donate them to a mosque in Logan Airport in Boston. So now all of the filing cabinets that were holding our data for MDMA are in mosque, holding spiritual documents, I would assume. And at that point, he also asked me if I needed help transporting the bed, which was the one object I really wanted, really nice bed. And he stuffed it in his SUV and brought it all the way to my apartment, helped me haul it up 3 flights of stairs, and then she said, I gotta go deliver the filing cabinets, and that was it. I went back to the site and see we were left with a couple couches and the kitchen table, and these women had responded that they were interested in all the furniture. They showed up, there's 3 amazing women, and single-handedly lugged all of the things out, putting them on their heads and putting it into the U-Haul. And it turns out the woman that was taking the furniture had been experiencing homelessness for about 10 years prior to this. That felt really good too. I'm glad that, the couch where the participants are having their MDMA sessions is now with her. And finally, at the end of the night, we're left with this really big physician scale, a weight beam scale, and super heavy. I mean, my assistant were like, what are we gonna do with this thing? It's like 10 at night. I had posted on Craigslist a few hours before, but we had to be out by midnight, and everything always up to the last minute. And then the doorbell rang. And I went to the door, and there's this woman there, and she's like, hi, I don't know if I'm in the right place, but I'm looking for a scale. And she showed me the picture of the physician scale, and I was like, yeah, come on in. She runs a nonprofit, and she's been looking for a scale like this for a couple of years. So she took the scale away, and then all that was left was one chair. I actually wanted to show a picture of it. It's a perfect gestalt. So it's the one object I couldn't get out of there. It was also a rug, but I took a picture standing at the doorway, and it's just this empty chair. That's all that was left in the therapy room. I don't know if you guys are familiar with gestalt. Yeah. Yeah, and through my coworker, I shed a couple tears and turned the lights out, and that was it. Say goodbye to the site. Really, really powerful letting go of the space. It's like an inner space, outer space thing. And then I spent the next 10 days, so before coming here, I came here on the 15th of September. I was like actually lugging a box of files an hour before I came to the airport. You have to archive all the files, so that was a process. And yeah, just shutting down all the accounts, the alarm system. I think I'm digressing now into a different process, but I don't know, I think it's a good time to open up for questions.
Tell us a bit more, because I'm not sure everyone is familiar as well with the MDMA study. Was this MDMA for trauma recovery, you said?
Yeah, PTSD.
PTSD.
Yeah, I think initially it was even labeled treatment-resistant PTSD.
Okay. And was that a combination of people through like war veterans and interpersonal trauma? What kind of people?
Yeah, so we had war veterans, combat veterans, a lot of childhood trauma, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, rape victims, rape survivors, and car accidents, losing loved ones to car accidents, physical traumas, other, ailments, chronic illness. Yeah. And, one of the tougher parts is people coming with index trauma. So that's, the index trauma had to qualify for criterion A of PTSD, which is that you either perceived your life was at risk or your life was at risk, so you could have died from the trauma. However, it was never really just the index trauma. Once people start having the psychedelic experience, especially with MDMA, typically there's always more that came up. So with a lot of childhood experiences, things they didn't even know that they were impacted by. So things they dissociated from. And then often realizing how numb they had become to positive experiences. So suddenly feeling empathy and joy. And then on top of that, kind of feeling sadness and grief that they weren't able to connect with those positive emotions at the time. Yeah.
Thanks very much, by the way, for sharing all these sort of personal color and subjective insights. I really enjoyed hearing about the art therapy and the music. Was there any dancing?
Awesome. Yeah. Right. Yes, there was.
Seeing as everyone's supposed to lie down.
Totally, right. Okay, I was just talking about it today. Yeah, so it's not like, we definitely, you can't insist someone stays still, right? Especially if they need. So sometimes people get up and there'd be a little bit of that. I can say that after the sessions, yeah. But it really, I don't know how to answer it exactly. Like, a lot of trauma, or a lot of the experiences involve the freezing response, right? So you feel frozen, can't move, or literally people had been in captivity or stuck somewhere. So to insist the person stays still would really compound an experience of trauma. And I think there's discomfort as well with moving. So a lot of people were maybe at the beginning of their healing journey. So the movement might come later. But yeah, after the session, there was definitely a continuation. Some people did artwork, drawing, painting, some poetry, writing, and then some really wanted to keep the music going. Yeah, so they would either play it really loud or put the headphones on. And often, like I said, some participants really wanted privacy to continue. So as a night attendant, I had some people who always had the door closed. I would make sure they were okay. But so they could have been proven all night, I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks. I've got a friend that listens to Tool as well while she has her ketamine therapy.
To listen
to Tool.
Tool?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
I think they got a song called 56 and Done or something like that. It's about shadow work.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, right. I mean, you learn to appreciate how all forms of music can be part of someone's therapeutic process. Doesn't have to just do the kind of yoga, Zen, spa. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Hi, first of all, thanks again for sharing all these really interesting experiences. I just wanted to ask about the exclusion criteria. You mentioned that there were a few that were not publicly disclosed in the actual kind of like website. Can you remember like a few examples or perhaps the reasons why you didn't disclose this?
I think I'll keep it vague because there are certain things I'm not fair about. Confidentiality and like what my obligation is. Like, so for example, I'm not talking about data right now. If I was going to present about data, I would have had to get approval like 30 days in advance from NAPS. Some of the criteria could have been destabilizing, like if someone realized that they didn't need the study due to that criteria, it could be destabilizing, I say, triggering, right? Like, because you just don't know where someone's going to go with that. And it's not even something you might think would be a trigger. but you don't know what people's history is. Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe the weight limit, but that was public. Like, it's gonna be above a certain weight. Yeah. Stuff like that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
Okay, that's fine,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah.
I just wanted to say that was a really heartfelt account of your experiences. So thank you for that. And my question was, what are some of the other ways that you simulated sacredness?
Great, thank you. Well, so yeah, my paintings, other paintings. Occasionally, as long as the person was okay with it, a scent, whether it was incense, palo santo, maybe a little sage. People were welcome to bring their own sacred objects. Some people set up a whole altar for themselves. Plants, I always have you live plants in the room. Lots of fluffy blankets, which sacred, I think. Yeah. See, I often would meditate before the experimental sessions. So just sitting in the space and bringing in my own sense of compassion, love. And unbeknownst, I didn't need to share it. I felt you could impact a space, through vibration. Our hearts impact each other. Heart Math Institute, they do a lot of studies about synchronizing heartbeats and brainwaves, right? Let's see, what else did I do? I don't know, always invited the participant to set the space themselves too. And some people need it with religious trauma too. So I want to be really careful with not using religious vocabulary or even too spiritual. Some people didn't need, some people don't need very specific spiritual language. And what they did need was human, practical, earth-based, things like that. Sometimes I would chant again before they would get there. Yeah. It's interesting. I feel it's been a long time almost already since the experimental sessions. What would you do to make a space sacred?
Love that.
You'd have to come back to me.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right. I mean, I try to keep the clinical things like, medical equipment out of visual sight, because we always have to check blood pressure, vitals. Just keep them in a corner. The person doesn't need to be staring at a stethoscope the whole session. And the alarm system, which we had a panel in the therapy space, we covered it with a tapestry. Or things that were obvious signs of it being a clinical space, doing concealing. Yeah. Yeah, and then leaving a little bit of blank space. So one of the participants talked about how valuable it was to have blank space, whether it was on a ceiling or a wall. That's whatever they need. Thanks. Yeah.
Wouldn't the music be, the kind of music they were listening to, be a confounding variable? And how did you control for that?
Awesome. Well, since it's part of the protocol, oh man, this is great. Do you know, so Alexithymia, it's the inability to identify emotion, right? Am I getting that right? So then there's also anhedonia. So that's an inability to be emotionally moved by music, for example. So my team talked a lot about wanting to have a metric for that. There wasn't a metric for that. I guess since it was part of the protocol, it was considered folded into the actual treatment. There is, is this going out? No, here we go. Have you heard of wave house? Some in London, right? So like trying to figure out what the actual healing component of the music is. Some people might even say that the music itself is more core and important than the actual therapy. I think it was a synergy, really. Yeah. That sort of answer your question a little bit.
Kind of.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of my own experiences and how listening to different things has put me in different mindsets. even just walking to class in the morning, and a different, like, I kind of create like my own experience by listening. Like if I was listening to hard techno, there's like, that's a certain vibe I'm creating,
Right.
as opposed to something gentler, like classical music would be a different, you know, so like, how did you, I think that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge growing point. Should I keep using this? Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a big growing point, I would say, in psychedelic-assisted therapy. How is the music impacting, and what is it to curate versus elicit, right? Or have the music be more of a curative agent. So one time I did show up as a night attendant, and I noticed the atmosphere was very heavy, and I heard the music that was playing. I was like, wow, I'm not sure I would want to end my day like this. As I checked in with the participant, and we transitioned out of that music. But I'd say it's a huge growing point, and a point for researchers to dive into, right? Because like, I was just talking to someone about art-based research of, I consider it, there's qualitative, but I know there's some ways to make it quantitative. Yeah.
To add to that, you should check out Mendel Kalin.
Okay.
Imperial. He's
Yeah.
developed a piece of software that allows therapists.
That's way past, yeah.
Yeah, WavePath, thank you. Yeah, Wave allows therapists to, using a cursor and pre-recorded music, make the music more challenging, more calming, using those kind of adjectives, which means that the therapist doesn't have to be a musician, but can still tailor the experience to some extent in that atmospheric way you describe. But my question for Courtney is so how does it compare to your experiences in medicine work? So with your, I think your bio mentioned your curandera in Peru, is it?
Right. Which is legal in South America. Great. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I have had the privilege of going to Peru 3 times now. The first time was for an anthropology course, which was through an accredited university in the United States. So we were not allowed to drink ayahuasca at that point. But we did a full ayahuasca ceremony where the curandero did drink the ayahuasca, and a lot of us had visual experiences. So it was a really, really cool experience for me to recognize the potency of being even in the atmosphere of plant medicine. The next time I went was 40 days. So I spent 40 days in the jungle, mostly by myself with curandera. Setting wise, she was incredible. She is incredible. She's still there. The ethos, for example, are the medicine songs that the curandera sings throughout the experience. And I felt like it was like a carpet, like a magic carpet or something, like really carrying me through the journey. And that's what I would compare the music during an MDMA session. Like if it stops, if the ethos stopped, it was almost like some aspect of the journey would stop, you know, kind of like a stalling out. Integration was always really important. That was hard with the language barrier in Peru. That was great when I had a friend there that would help translate and talk to Donna, her name. What specifically? What elements?
So, like, what are the similarities and differences, I guess, as you see them? You mentioned you have like a sacred bowl to give the MDMA in, but say, as much as the music may have a comparative effect on the atmosphere because of your widened perceptual openness, like the Icaros are sung by Donna intimately every moment. She's thinking about the next syllable and they're coming from her voice box and her lungs and her embodiment. Whereas I guess a Spotify playlist, even though the participant may have contributed in some way to that playlist, it's a little bit more what would you,
yeah, technical. Like,
canned.
there's an element of technology between the person and the music. I love live music. and the vibration of the actual voice in the room. And at the same time, I've opened up a bit more to technology and how we can utilize it and not always be 100% negative, you know, like, oh, it's technology, it's a computer, curated playlist, but, I had another piece of that.
Well, for example, yeah.
Yeah,
Did
go
the
ahead.
participants themselves have experiences with psychedelics outside of this study? Was that an exclusion criteria? And if they did they have experience in medicine work, in the ceremony work?
Specific criteria was you cannot have taken MDMA more than 10 times in the last 5 years.
Okay.
Or maybe it was 10 years, can't remember. Yeah. That's as specific as I'm gonna get with that one. Some people access other therapies in other countries, similar to like what I did. So going to Mexico, the Heroic Hearts Project is actually also UK based. So they bring veterans to Mexico and a couple other places, Peru as well. Yeah, there's a lot more self-processing, I guess, right? So in the plant medicine experience, at least in the jungle. So probably also more spiritual vocabulary, you know. And you're not just working with ayahuasca, so like it wasn't just ayahuasca, I was working with these other plants as well. Like I was bathing in something called aforementioned, which is a relative of garlic. And pulverize the leaves, which took about 3 hours, and make a big bath. And it would sit in the sun every day, but I would get, you know, Donna would bring me outside and pour it all over me, and I wasn't allowed to shower or wash it off. And every day it got more and more pungent. So I was really, wow, it was really humbling experience. It was a dream worker, so I had some of the most incredible dreams that I still remember today. And felt, you know, my experience with ayahuasca, I thought there'd be a lot of purging. I thought it would be like cathartic experience of getting the bad out of me, the impure. But the messages I got were, you're not impure. And it's a lot more about the ideas about myself that I've taken on. So I felt like it was a little bit more of an external cleaning. And that's why Apostasha was a really great swamp monster kind of spirit. And I felt really helped clean that gunk away. And yeah, for me, the process was a lot about, you know, learning I'm not bad.
So I was thinking about the contradiction between isolating the variables and these synergies. And I imagine people were discussing a lot about that in the meetings. So how did they do that? It sounds like a difficult thing to do, right? If you want to know how the kind of like chemical substance is doing its work and you have the placebo, how do you kind of like explain the synergistic thing with music and other stuff? And then I have another one about the clinical setting, why you need to hide the stethoscope. I have an answer for that personally, because a hospital is full of trauma.
Yeah.
If they have accidents, probably you're there recovering. So I don't want to think about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But I just wanted to know, what do you think about those
well,
things?
Yeah, your first question, I think, is like the question. It's still, I mean, I feel it's still really early on in psychedelic research. So if someone asks me like what specifically is one of the biggest questions and growing points for, or like one of the more difficult aspects for psychedelic research, it would be that. Like these substances alone open up so many variables, multidimensional, you know, aspects of the self, maybe one has never even tuned in with. And same with our environment. It's like, how do you boil down the actual variable? Some of the metrics that we used, like we did a self-compassion metric, we did altered state of consciousness metric. We always wanted to do more of an empathy metric. So if you start doing more neurological research, I know there's some using fMRIs, but if you could somehow, again, you know, put someone on psychedelics into a machine like that, does that become a confounding variable? But noticing which parts of the brain are firing off at the same time a therapeutic process is going on. So maybe if we get better instruments too down the road, more subtle, right? Yeah, I'd say that is a huge area for future researchers to keep figuring out. And then at the same time, maybe letting go of the need to boil it down or reduce it to one specific thing. You know, maybe it's about becoming open and considering synergy to be just as valid as isolating variable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you already have all the indigenous rituals doing that, right?
Yeah.
Don't care about that. So the Western way is isolating the stuff. So,
Yeah.
So I mean, if we move down, it's like, yes, we already have 2,000 years of
Right.
synergistic
Mm-hmm.
approaches.
This is true. This is true. And you can see how the one single point, the quantitative point, fits in with the synergy, and somehow find ways to track it all and then tease out that one point that you're interested in. That's kind of what we're talking about anyway, right?
Yeah.
All right, so the clinical question, why hide the medical equipment? I mean, yeah, some trauma specifically having to do with medical care or being in the hospital. If someone really wanted the stethoscope in front of them though, I would definitely not.
Not me.
It's totally up to them, right? Like, no. Actually,
Bad treat for me.
right. No, you know what, there were people who were really concerned about their blood pressure. So they wanted the blood pressure cuff right there. You know? But it's like really person-centered. You know, like what's gonna make them feel, what's gonna help them feel safe. And also what's gonna help them feel open to sharing with the therapist when they don't feel safe or what their needs are, you know. The alarm system, I don't think anyone really wanted to stare at that, but they know it's there. The clock, the ticking analog clock. Yeah, there was one person that did like that though. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks though. Those are good questions. Yeah. Otis?
Can I respond to Ernest? Like, why make this distinction between Western civilization, Western science does this well, isolating components, having like this, naming them, classifying, making them into substances, and like non-Western, like accounting for the practice itself. Why make this distinction? Because now in science, there's like in the past few years, there's a post-Newtonian method, so like using non-linear dynamic systems or like network theory, all of this stuff, there you don't isolate components. You see attractor points, you see all kinds of other stuff that don't need to like single out specific elements. So there's methods in the Western civilization, in Western science, to not isolate and to seek to have a different kind of epistemology. So I don't see why make
You
this.
think that is in clinical trial the case? Because you have the placebo, the control group, right? You want to isolate. So maybe we have the methods. I'm not saying we don't, but it doesn't seem to be, I mean, not to me at least now, the case for a clinical trial, right? If not, why you need a placebo, why you need to isolate the music, right? All those things, even the music, if you get to think about this in terms of like terms of anthropology, is a whole ritual in itself.
Yeah.
Like for me that I'm Mexican, probably Enya or whatever is gonna get on my nerves, right?
Oh, come on.
Yes, or whatever, like a jogi sort of thing. So just let's not even think about the substance. Let's get with the music, right? Just there. And when they were talking about this algorithmic thing about challenging music, I was thinking, wow, that would be a piece of Eurocentric technology all in itself.
How do you have placebo music though?
Yeah, that would be. I mean, you could, right?
Why noise?
Right, yeah.
Noise.
Yeah. So how do
It's a
you
research question.
how do you control synergy?
Well, here, this is another thing I didn't address, like, we're not really measuring MDMA alone, it's MDMA-assisted therapy.
Yeah.
That's the variable right there, like. So that alone, that variable is multidimensional.
The placebo group had quite good success, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I gather there was somebody who had a significant adverse experience in the placebo group. I don't know if that was in your center or whatever. But I mean, did you have any observations about the potency of the placebo?
Oh, yeah. I mean, incredible. Like, like that experience I explained where someone really thought they got a DNA. And what we found was that they've never felt held before. Never felt like someone was supporting them. It's like they didn't experience feeling of safety, which downregulates the nervous system and can open up neural pathways in the same way that a psychedelic could. Yeah, so the placebo group did have a lot of success.
Yeah, I'm blinded then,
Yeah.
sorry, I was just wondering about that, and then how do they feel after that?
Oh,
That's what I told.
it's a complicated response.
But now you can have the real thing, and then it
Yeah.
has to be really.
Yeah, there was, oh man, it almost, like, they felt like after, I'm gonna leave that out. It's tentative, the personal details of their experiences. But they weren't sure they wanted to come back and do the MDMA, therapy. It took a little bit of exploring with the therapy team to decide that they'd come back. And they had already reached certain levels of healing and recovery in between the placebo and the next phase. They were in a place that was kind of like, why mess with a good thing? Like I feel, in a good place. But ultimately, it was a positive experience for that participant. Yeah.
Can I ask you a follow-on question? What was the rationale for actually giving the placebo group the MDMA and the same experience? Because was it an ethical consideration?
Yeah.
Because you gave them an active psychological therapy, right?
Right. No, it was ethics. Yeah. Because although there was really incredible improvements in the placebo group, the p-value for the MDMA group was so significant that it was considered to be unethical to not offer them that treatment after the placebo. It was also really interesting, they got like double the therapy, right?
Yeah.
Like, so that was pretty cool. Yeah. Actually, just real quick, Rick also argued with the FDA, or tried to propose to the FDA, that we drop the placebo entirely for that second phase because we already have proved the statistical significance of the treatment, and to even put people through the process of the placebo is unethical. But they wanted one more round of 100 participants. So yeah. One more.
Yeah, with me or someone else? Sorry.
You guys battle between the two of you.
It's all right.
There's still time. We still have like
I just wanted to know if the integration process was standardized or not.
Standardized in the therapeutic approach?
Mm-hmm.
No, not necessarily. Yeah, I mean, some of the therapists have more of a psychodynamic background. Internal family systems. But it was not, no, it was really following the participant's process. Yeah, so what was coming up for them and what they felt was going to be most helpful. Yeah.
I was going to ask something actually similar to that, because you mentioned like the some of the participants appear to kind of like bring up internal parts, kind of like from the IFS system. Kind of like, I want to ask whether the therapists were all trained in that system and whether they knew how to handle this, because not like a mainstream type of intervention, is it?
You say it's not? It's not a mainstream? Yeah. All the therapists on my team were trained in it. Yeah, and I got to meet Dick Schwartz a couple times. I think he was the one that established the practice. So some of the therapists spoke a lot more directly to parts and part work, like shared with their participant what it would be termed in IFS. And I think there was enough overlap with all the practitioners on the study, I suppose, and internal family systems. And a lot of people maybe using it in their private practice. But I think it's possible to kind of apply theory without having to dive into like, oh, this is the firefighter part of you, or this is the protector. But but just the aspect of protection, I think that was a really big part of it. What the way that we adapt to trauma can be and often are really paradoxical and contradictory. And the protector could be pushing away a healing agent, so something that's actually going to be really helpful, but to shame or be angry at that protector or protecting is going to like compound the trauma and keep adding these layers. So it's like math. Yeah. Psychic surgery. Any other questions here? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, just more. What was the sample sizes for each group?
100.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's 100 each time. Yeah. Yeah. Over there?
I'm sorry if it's maybe too big because we're nearing the end of the scheduled session, but I was just very curious about at what point do you foresee these kinds of interventions becoming more mainstream? And at what point in the future do you think there is enough weight of evidence to push for a broader state of appeal for these kinds of interventions?
Well, so we're mass submitting the NDA, the new drug application, within the next couple of months. And the hope is to have FDA approval by October 2020, no, maybe early spring of 2024, or maybe this fall of 2024. So that's at least MDMA-assisted therapy getting approved. My question is more about scalability and quality, like quality of trainer, criteria, like what qualifies someone to be doing this work, and how well are they being supported? Right, the supervision is so crucial. I can see these therapies being approved of within the next few years. Even psilocybin-assisted therapy, Mass General, Johns Hopkins, all the hospitals around Boston are doing a lot of research. But my question is a little bit more about quality and accessibility as well. And so, like hearing about how they're trying to design the insurance models, like you guys said the NHS here, but a lot of the insurance in the States is all private, or provided through your employer. So the question of how is the insurance company going to be covering this? How is it going to be affordable? Like right now, most of the ketamine-assisted therapies out of pocket, like $4,000 session. Yeah, does that answer?
It's very interesting about accessibility, I think, in particular, particularly when I'm not sure in the US, but these are obviously controlled substances in the UK.
Right.
So I don't know exactly if that makes a huge impact on the funds. I assume it does, just because the production of them would be tightly controlled.
Yeah, and then there's also like the ethnocentric model of individual therapy, right? So a lot of other cultural models of community-based therapy. So there's talk about MDMA group therapy. And how do you have therapists that a client is going to resonate with and feel represented by, and like be able to build a trusting rapport to creating programs for that. Just goes on and on and on. Yeah. Important questions. Any other lingering curiosities?
So it's related to that. I just wondered, but you might not be able to say,
Yeah.
and NDA, but whether MAPs are doing any work, because that's a really intense model, isn't it? The therapist I had, all those sessions. Are they doing anything to look to see what the minimum dose is? Because my understanding is they plumped for that model was kind of just arbitrary. Like, well,
Right.
I was speaking to my commit hub actually, like they didn't do loads of. It doesn't feel like they've just said, oh, it's four sections necessary, or could you get away with one?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, is there?
Oh, well.
And then whether you need 2 therapists and.
Yeah, there's definitely talk about, can we do less sessions? Can we shorten the sessions? I forget who it was, whether it was the FDA or the board, asked us if we could do sessions that were 6 hours long. And Rick was very much so not into that. I think there was, I'm not sure how they deduced, but just 2 sessions wasn't cutting it. I think 3, what's the 3 is not to see a pattern.
Yeah.
right, and you get 2, it's like, I almost feel a little lopsided. But were you even referring to dosing?
Yeah, they
Yeah.
think all of it really,
Yeah.
like, really, yeah,
I-
or different approaches.
I think they found that there's a threshold with downregulating the amygdala, so like 75 milligrams of MDMA, that has to be like above 75 in order to achieve the chemistry, the biochemistry, and the physiological state that's ideal for the trauma work, is what they found. So you're talking about the traumas and re-trigger, like refire the system. So that's another, I think, one of the bigger reasons MDMA is being used for this treatment. Are the doses, are you guys familiar with the doses that we use? I think that's public knowledge, right? Okay, yeah. So it's like 80 milligrams for the first dose, first session, with 40 milligram booster, like 2 hours later. And then the second session, we start with 120 milligrams with a 40 milligram booster. Yeah. On that.
Do you know how that compares to average recreational dosing? Like how much is it?
Like 100 milligrams is considered like an average recreational dose. From what I heard, yeah.
Sorry, did you ever find like a difference in the kind of the weight of the participant in terms of the reaction? So again, a lot of medications I use as milligrams per kilo. Did you find that in your study at all?
No, it was a really interesting thing. Didn't find it. I think the criteria of the minimal weight was a little bit more related to other things, not the actual. Yeah. No, it was really interesting. Yeah, that weight didn't seem to have any impact on it.
Did you see? Sorry,
No, yes.
did you see a big difference between in terms of dosing, like the reaction they'd have between a starter dose of 80 versus the starter dose of 120?
Yeah, some participants opted for the lower dose after they had experience with the higher dose. There was some question about memory, like wanting to remember the experience. And at the lower dose, some people found that it was just easier to have a cohesive, cognitive, both experience and then afterwards remembering. It's not like they forgot, there wasn't a blackout experience, but yeah. And are being able to articulate, right? Yeah, so that was I really liked when participants knew what they were looking for and wanted in that experience. It is pretty significant difference, 80 milligrams to 120. Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Right, so we are at time. It's been great to see inside an MDMA study through the lived experience of Courtney. A big thank you to Courtney.